Julia Fairfax adjusted the pillow behind her grandmother's head for the third time in 10 minutes, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the worn cotton fabric. The harsh fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast everything in an unforgiving pale glow, making Rose's paper-thin skin appear almost translucent. At 31, Julia had learned to read the subtle changes in her grandmother's breathing, the way her eyelids fluttered during moments of consciousness, the slight pressure of her fingers when she was trying to communicate something words could no longer express. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The machines surrounding Rose's bed hummed their electronic lullabies, each beep and whistle marking another moment in what Julia knew would be their final conversation. She'd been here for 18 hours straight, leaving only twice to use the restroom and once to grab a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her own appearance reflected the toll of the past 3 years. Her auburn hair, once glossy and carefully styled for her social work position in San Francisco, now hung limp around her shoulders, streaked with premature gray she couldn't afford to color. Her clothes, a faded pair of jeans and a sweater with a small hole near the left elbow, spoke of someone whose priorities had shifted entirely from personal maintenance to caring for others. Julia? Rose's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the ambient hospital noise like a bell. Julia leaned forward immediately, taking her grandmother's hand in both of hers. "I'm here, Grandma. I'm right here." Rose's eyes, still sharp despite her body's failing, focused on Julia's face with the intensity that had made her such a formidable presence throughout Julia's childhood. "You gave up so much," she said, each word requiring effort. "Your job, your life in the city." "Shh, don't worry about that now." Julia's voice carried the practiced calm she'd developed over months of similar conversations. "You needed me, that's what matters." But Rose's grip tightened with surprising strength. "It matters to me. Your parents, they don't see." She paused, struggling for breath. "They don't see what you've sacrificed." Julia felt her throat tighten. It was true, though she'd never voiced it aloud. When Rose's health had begun declining 3 years ago, it had been Julia who received the midnight phone calls, Julia who'd found her grandmother confused and disoriented in her Victorian house, Julia who'd made the decision to abandon her promising career to move back home. Her parents, Linda and Robert, had expressed gratitude, certainly, but it had always felt perfunctory, as if Julia's sacrifice was simply the natural order of things. "Emma called yesterday," Rose continued, her voice growing fainter, "from Los Angeles. She sounded busy." Julia's jaw clenched involuntarily. Emma had indeed called, a 15-minute conversation filled with updates about her latest audition, her pregnancy symptoms, and her husband David's newest film project. She'd asked about Rose's condition almost as an afterthought, and when Julia had suggested she might want to visit soon, Emma had launched into a detailed explanation of her busy schedule and the difficulty of flying while pregnant. "She's coming for the funeral," Julia said quietly, though the words tasted bitter. "She promised." Rose's eyes studied Julia's face, reading the hurt that Julia tried so hard to hide. "You've been alone in this." It wasn't a question, and Julia didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew that while Emma had been building her life in Hollywood, Julia had been here, managing Rose's medications, driving her to doctor appointments, adapting the old Victorian house to accommodate a walker, and eventually a wheelchair. She'd learned to navigate insurance companies, communicate with specialists, and make countless small decisions that kept Rose comfortable and dignified. "The house," Rose said suddenly, her voice taking on an urgency that made Julia lean closer. "Julia, there are things about the house." But before she could finish, Rose's eyes closed and her breathing became labored. Julia pressed the call button for the nurse, her heart racing as she watched her grandmother slip away from consciousness. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical activity, hushed conversations with doctors, and the steady decline that Julia had been expecting but wasn't prepared for. When Rose finally passed at 3:47 a.m., Julia was holding her hand, whispering stories about the garden they'd tended together and the recipes Rose had taught her during quiet afternoons in the kitchen. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia sat with Rose's body for 20 minutes before finally reaching for her phone to make the calls she'd been dreading. Her parents answered on the second ring, as if they'd been waiting. "How was she at the end?" Linda asked, her voice thick with sleep and something that might have been guilt. "Peaceful," Julia replied, though the word felt inadequate. She wasn't in pain. "Thank God for that," Robert's voice came through the background. "You did everything you could, Julia. We're grateful." The words should have been comforting, but they felt flat. Grateful. As if Julia's 3 years of devotion had been a favor rather than love. The call to Emma was more complicated. It went to voicemail twice before Emma finally answered, clearly having been wakened by the persistent ringing. "Jules, what time is it?" "Grandma Rose passed away this morning." Julia's voice was steady, professional almost. She'd learned to deliver difficult news with calm efficiency during her social work training. There was a pause, then the sound of Emma sitting up in bed. "Oh my God, was she? I mean, how?" "She was comfortable. I was with her." "Thank you," Emma said, and for a moment her voice cracked with genuine emotion. "I should have been there. I should have come sooner." "Yes," Julia said simply, "you should have." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll fly out today. David's in pre-production, but he'll come for the funeral. We'll need to. There are arrangements to make." "I'll handle them. I know what she wanted." There was something in Emma's tone that Julia couldn't quite identify. Relief, maybe, or resignation. You always knew her better than anyone. After hanging up, Julia sat in the hospital chair until the nurses gently suggested she might want to go home and rest. She drove through the empty streets in her 10-year-old Honda Civic, past the 24-hour diner where she and Rose used to stop for ice cream after doctor appointments, past the pharmacy where she'd picked up countless prescriptions, past all the landmarks of a life that had become smaller and smaller until it revolved entirely around caregiving. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Victorian house stood silhouetted against the dawn sky, its gabled roof lines and ornate trim dark against the lightening horizon. Julia had always loved this house, with its wide front porch and stained glass windows, its built-in bookcases and hardwood floors that creaked in familiar patterns. Rose had bought it in 1975, a young widow determined to create a home for herself and her future family. It had been Julia's refuge during childhood visits, a place of wonder and safety that smelled of lavender and old books. Now it felt enormous and empty. Julia climbed the front steps slowly, her key turning in the lock with a sound that seemed to echo through the neighborhood. Inside, everything was exactly as she'd left it the morning before. Rose's reading glasses on the side table, her half-finished crossword puzzle, the Afghan Julia had draped over her lap during their last evening together. The silence was oppressive. For 3 years, this house had been filled with the sounds of life. Rose's walker tapping across the floors, the low murmur of television programs, their conversations about everything and nothing. Now it felt like a museum, preserved but lifeless. Julia's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, her best friend from college, who'd remained a constant presence despite the distance between San Francisco and Julia's small hometown. Jessica was one of the few people who truly understood what Julia had given up. She'd been Julia's roommate during graduate school, had celebrated when Julia landed her dream job at a family services nonprofit in San Francisco, had watched with growing concern as Julia's visits home became longer and more frequent until they became permanent. Julia stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "She's gone. I don't know what to do now." The response came immediately. "You take care of yourself for once. You've earned it." But Julia wasn't sure she remembered how to do that. For 3 years, her entire identity had been built around being Rose's caregiver. She'd become expert at anticipating needs, managing crises, sacrificing her own wants for someone else's necessities. The thought of suddenly having no one to care for was both liberating and terrifying. She walked through the house slowly, noting all the modifications she'd made to accommodate Rose's declining mobility. The ramp Marcus Rodriguez had built over the front steps, the grab bars in the bathroom, the hospital bed that had replaced Rose's antique four-poster in the master bedroom. Each change told the story of their journey together, marking time, not in months or years, in losses of independence and dignity that Julia had tried desperately to cushion. The funeral home's parking lot looked like a scene from a Hollywood movie, at least in corner where Emma's rental car was parked. The sleek black sedan stood out among the practical sedans and pickup trucks of their small town, its California plates and pristine finish announcing the arrival of someone who'd clearly outgrown their origins. Julia watched from the funeral home's window as Emma emerged from the driver's seat in what could only be described as a performance. Even pregnant, Emma moved with the calculated grace she'd perfected during her years of acting classes and auditions. Her designer maternity dress, a deep navy that photographed well in any lighting, complemented her carefully highlighted blonde hair and professionally applied makeup. She looked like someone who'd stepped off a magazine cover about stylish expectant mothers, not someone arriving to bury her grandmother. Julia caught her reflection in the funeral home's mirror and immediately regretted it. Her own black dress was 3 years old, purchased for a colleague's funeral during her San Francisco days. It hung loosely on her frame now, evidence of the weight she'd lost during months of stress and irregular meals grabbed between caregiving tasks. Her face was pale and drawn, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that emphasized the dark circles under her eyes. "Julia!" Emma's voice carried across the funeral home's lobby, drawing every head in their direction. She swept toward Julia with arms outstretched, enveloping her in a cloud of expensive perfume and practiced sympathy. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner. The flight delays were just horrible, and with the pregnancy, well, you know how it is." Julia submitted to the embrace, feeling the subtle shift in the room's energy as everyone's attention focused on Emma. It was a phenomenon Julia had observed countless times throughout their lives. Emma's ability to command a space simply by entering it. Conversations that had been focused on offering Julia condolences suddenly turned toward Emma's pregnancy, her flight from Los Angeles, her husband's film career. "Everyone's been asking about you," Julia said quietly as they separated, "about your acting career." Emma's smile was radiant. "Actually, I have some exciting news. I can't announce it officially yet, but I booked a recurring role on a Netflix series. 3 episodes in the first season, with potential for more if the show gets renewed. It's not huge, but it's exactly the kind of visibility I need." The small crowd of relatives and family friends that had gathered around them erupted in congratulations. Julia watched as Emma basked in the attention, graciously accepting praise for her success, while somehow managing to look appropriately solemn for the occasion. It was a masterful performance, one that made Julia feel simultaneously proud of her sister and resentful of the timing. "Where's David?" Julia asked when there was a brief lull in the congratulations. "He'll be here tomorrow morning, just before the service. He's in the final stages of securing funding for his next project, and there was a crucial meeting he absolutely couldn't miss. You understand how these things work in the industry." Julia nodded, though she didn't understand at all. What she understood was that David had prioritized a business meeting over supporting his wife during her grandmother's funeral, just as Emma had prioritized her career over visiting Rose during her final illness. The funeral director, Mr. Patterson, approached with the diplomatic smile that was part of his professional toolkit. "Miss Fairfax," he said to Emma, "your grandmother was such a beloved member of our community. I know she would be so proud to see how successful you've become." "Thank you," Emma replied, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "She always believed in following your dreams. I think my career would have made her happy." Julia felt something cold settle in her stomach. Rose had rarely mentioned Emma's career, except to express quiet concern about the instability and frequent financial stress. What Rose had talked about during their long evenings together was Julia's sacrifice, Julia's kindness, Julia's presence during the hardest moments. But somehow, in death as in life, Emma's distant achievements overshadowed Julia's immediate devotion. The viewing proceeded with Emma holding court near the casket, sharing carefully edited stories about Rose's influence on her life. She spoke about childhood summers spent in the Victorian house, about Rose's encouragement of her artistic aspirations, about phone calls where Rose had expressed pride in Emma's perseverance. Each story was technically true, but felt incomplete to Julia, who knew the fuller picture of Rose's concerns and disappointments. "Your sister certainly has a way with people," said Mrs. Henderson, who lived next door to Rose and had become a friend during Julia's caregiving years. The comment was made with the careful neutrality that small-town residents perfected when discussing sensitive family dynamics. Julia had been present for countless afternoons when Julia had helped Rose with shopping and yard work. She'd witnessed the daily reality of caregiving that Emma's sporadic phone calls couldn't capture. Emma's career keeps her very busy, Julia replied diplomatically. Of course, Mrs. Henderson said, though I have to say, Rose talked about you constantly. How proud she was of everything you'd given up to be here with her. She used to say you were the strongest person she knew. Julia felt tears threaten for the first time since Rose's death. The validation was overwhelming, partly because it was so rare. Throughout the caregiving years, most family conversations had focused on Emma's career updates or their parents' concerns about Julia wasting her education and putting her life on hold. The evening's most difficult moment came when Emma approached the casket for a private goodbye. Julia watched as her sister stood silently for several minutes, her shoulders shaking with what appeared to be genuine grief. When Emma turned back toward the room, her makeup was streaked and her composed facade had cracked. I should have been here more, she said quietly to Julia. I should have made the time. For a moment, Julia saw past the performance to the younger sister, who'd once followed her around Rose's house, begging to be included in whatever project Julia was working on. She knew you loved her, Julia said, though the words felt inadequate. Did she? Really? Because I feel like I failed her, like I failed you too, leaving you to handle everything alone. It was the closest Emma had ever come to acknowledging the inequity of their situation, and Julia felt a brief hope that perhaps this crisis might bring them closer together. But before she could respond, David arrived in a flurry of expensive luggage and industry jargon. David Martinez was the kind of man who announced his importance through his accessories, the Italian leather briefcase, the smartwatch that buzzed constantly with industry updates, the designer clothes that suggested success even when that success was more aspirational than actual. He swept Emma into an embrace that looked choreographed for maximum visual impact. Babe, I'm so sorry I'm late. The meeting ran long, but we got the green light on the project. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Emma's momentary vulnerability disappeared as she transformed back into the supportive wife of an ambitious filmmaker. That's wonderful, honey. Grandma Rose always said timing was everything. Julia doubted Rose had ever said anything of the sort, but she remained silent as David continued his monologue about investor meetings and distribution deals. Within minutes, the conversation had shifted entirely away from Rose's memory to David's career prospects, with Emma playing the role of devoted supporter. The evening concluded with Emma promising to help with funeral arrangements, though Julia noticed the promises were vague and conditional. We'll do whatever we can to help, Emma said, though with the pregnancy and David's project timeline, we might need to keep things simple. Julia nodded, already mentally cataloging the tasks she'd need to handle alone, coordinating with the florist, confirming the catering arrangements, writing the obituary, managing the guest list. It was the same pattern that had defined the past 3 years. Emma's presence was emotional and symbolic, while Julia handled the practical realities. As the funeral home emptied and Julia prepared to return to the silent Victorian house, she overheard a conversation between two of Rose's neighbors. That Emma certainly turned out well for herself, one was saying. Hollywood career, handsome husband, Rose must have been so proud. The other replied with careful neutrality. Though it was Julia who was here day and night. Julia who gave up her own life to take care of Rose. That takes a different kind of strength. Well, of course, that's just what Julia does. She's always been the practical one. The words stung more than any criticism could have. That's just what Julia does. As if her sacrifice was simply her nature, not a choice that had cost her a career, a relationship, a future she'd planned in San Francisco. As if caregiving was her destiny rather than her decision. 3 days after the funeral, Julia sat at Rose's dining room table, surrounded by sympathy cards she hadn't opened and legal documents she didn't fully understand. The Victorian house felt different now, heavy with the weight of decisions that needed to be made and conversations that needed to be had. Emma and David had been staying at the Grandview Inn, the town's only boutique hotel, claiming that being in Rose's house was too emotionally overwhelming for Emma in her pregnant state. Julia had spent those 3 days in a strange limbo, mechanically sorting through Rose's belongings and handling the endless administrative tasks that follow a death. Social Security needed to be notified, bank accounts closed, utility bills transferred. Each phone call felt like erasing another piece of Rose's existence, reducing a rich life to a series of account numbers and cancellation confirmations. The house itself seemed to echo with memories. Every room held traces of their 3 years together. The kitchen, where Julia had learned to prepare Rose's diabetic-friendly meals, the living room, where they'd watched classic movies during Rose's sleepless nights, the sunroom, where Rose had continued tending her African violets until her hands became too shaky to water them properly. "We need to talk about practical matters," Linda had said when she called that morning. "It's time to plan for the future." The phrase had an ominous quality that made Julia's stomach tighten. In her family's vocabulary, practical matters usually meant decisions that prioritized convenience over sentiment, efficiency over emotion. It was the same tone Linda had used when suggesting Julia move back home to care for Rose, presenting it as the logical solution rather than acknowledging the sacrifice involved. Now, sitting in Rose's formal dining room, Julia faced her family across the polished mahogany table that had been the centerpiece of countless holiday meals. Linda had arranged herself at what she clearly considered the head of the table, a stack of papers before her and her reading glasses positioned for maximum authority. Robert sat to her right, looking uncomfortable but resigned, while Emma and David occupied the chairs closest to the window, positioning themselves in the afternoon light that made Emma's pregnancy glow seem almost ethereal. "First," Linda began, consulting her notes with the efficiency of a former high school administrator, "we need to discuss Rose's estate. The house, obviously, is the primary asset." Julia felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd been dreading this conversation since the moment Rose died, knowing that her family's version of practical planning would likely exclude her own feelings about the home where she'd spent the past 3 years. "Emma's situation is complicated right now," Linda continued, her voice taking on the persuasive tone she'd once used to convince reluctant parents to accept their children's academic probation. "The pregnancy, David's career demands, the uncertainty of the entertainment industry, they need stability." David leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way that suggested he'd been practicing this speech. "We've been looking at real estate prices in Los Angeles, and honestly, we're priced out of anything decent. The mortgage payments alone would cripple us financially, especially with the baby coming." "This house, though," Emma added, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, "it's perfect for raising a family. All that space, the big yard, the safe neighborhood, everything we want for our daughter." Julia noticed how Emma had claimed the baby's gender with confidence, though they'd mentioned earlier that they were waiting to find out. It was a small thing, but typical of Emma's way of shaping narratives to support her arguments. "Of course, we'd want to honor Rose's memory," David continued. "Maybe turn her study into a nursery, keep some of her furniture for sentimental value. We understand the house has history." Robert cleared his throat, speaking for the first time since the family had gathered. "Julia, you've done a wonderful job caring for Rose these past years. We're all grateful for your sacrifice." The word sacrifice hung in the air like an accusation. Julia had noticed how her family framed her caregiving as a noble gesture, rather than acknowledging it as 3 years of her life spent in service to others. It was easier, she supposed, than confronting the fact that they had all been content to let her handle the burden alone. "But," Robert continued, "you're still young. You have time to rebuild your career, start over somewhere new. Emma and David, they're at a different stage of life. They need the kind of stability this house could provide." David leaned forward, his expression earnest in a way that suggested he'd been practicing this speech. "We've been looking at real estate prices in Los Angeles, and honestly, we're priced out of anything decent. The mortgage payments alone would cripple us financially, especially with the baby coming." "This house, though," Emma added, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, "it's perfect for raising a family. All that space, the big yard, the safe neighborhood, everything we want for our daughter." Julia noticed how Emma had claimed the baby's gender with confidence, though they'd mentioned earlier that they were waiting to find out. It was a small thing, but typical of Emma's way of shaping narratives to support her arguments. "Of course, we'd want to honor Rose's memory," David continued. "Maybe turn her study into a nursery, keep some of her furniture for sentimental value. We understand the house has history." Robert cleared his throat, speaking for the first time since the family had gathered. "Julia, you've done a wonderful job caring for Rose these past years. We're all grateful for your sacrifice." The word sacrifice hung in the air like an accusation.
Julia had noticed how her family framed her caregiving as a noble gesture, rather than acknowledging it as 3 years of her life spent in service to others. It was easier, she supposed, than confronting the fact that they'd all been content to let her handle the burden alone. But, Robert continued, you're still young. You have time to rebuild your career, start over somewhere new. Emma and David, they're at a different stage of life. They need the kind of stability this house could provide. Julia felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. I've been living here for 3 years, she said quietly. This is my home now. Temporarily, Linda corrected. You moved here to care for Rose. That situation has changed. The euphemism was breathtaking in its callousness. Rose's death wasn't a situation that had changed. It was the end of a life, the loss of a beloved family member, the conclusion of 3 years during which Julia had become more than a caregiver. She'd been Rose's companion, confidant, and closest family member. Julia, Emma said, her voice soft with what appeared to be genuine emotion. I know this is hard. I know you loved this place, but you have to think about what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone, or what's best for you? The words came out sharper than Julia had intended, but she was tired of the careful diplomacy that had characterized all their family interactions. David's expression hardened slightly. That's not fair, Julia. We're thinking about the baby, about providing a stable environment for the next generation. This house shouldn't just sit empty while Emma and I struggle to find affordable housing in LA. It wouldn't be sitting empty, Julia said. I live here. But for how long? Linda's question carried an edge of impatience. You can't stay here indefinitely, living off Rose's pension and Social Security. Those benefits end with her death. You need to be realistic about your future. Robert reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. We've prepared some paperwork, he said, sliding it across the table towards Julia. Julia stared at the documents without opening them. The papers looked official, expensive, the kind of legal instruments that spoke of finality and legal authority. You've already decided, she said. We've planned for the most practical outcome, Linda corrected. Emma and David have immediate needs, a growing family, career pressures, financial constraints. You, on the other hand, have options. You're educated, experienced, young enough to start over. I'm 31 years old, Julia said. I've been out of my field for 3 years. Do you have any idea how difficult it will be to rebuild a career after this gap? You'll figure it out, Emma said, with the breezy confidence of someone who'd never faced such a challenge. You're the strongest person I know, Jules. You always land on your feet. The casual dismissal of Julia's concerns was stunning. Emma spoke as if career rebuilding was simply a matter of determination, as if the connections Julia had spent years building hadn't withered during her absence, as if her resume gap wouldn't require extensive explanation to skeptical employers. What about what Rose wanted? Julia asked, though she realized even as she spoke that none of them had considered this question. Rose wanted what was best for the family, Linda said firmly. She would have wanted the house to go where it could do the most good. Did she ever tell you that? Julia's voice was rising, despite her efforts to stay calm. Because in 3 years of living with her, caring for her, listening to her concerns about the family, she never once suggested that Emma should inherit the house. David leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. What did she say exactly? Because I find it hard to believe that a grandmother wouldn't want her house to go to the grandchild who's starting a family. The question trapped Julia in an impossible position. Rose had indeed expressed concerns about Emma's lifestyle, David's financial instability, and the family's tendency to take Julia's sacrifices for granted. Those conversations had been private, shared during late-night moments when Rose's guard was down, and her gratitude made her unusually candid. To repeat them now would feel like a betrayal of her confidence, and would inevitably be dismissed as Julia's wishful thinking. She appreciated what I did for her, Julia said finally. She understood what I gave up. I'm sure she did, Emma said soothingly, and I'm sure she'd want you to get back to your own life now. You've put yourself on hold long enough. The meeting continued for another hour, with Julia raising practical objections that were systematically dismissed. Where would she live if she gave up the house? She could find an apartment, rent something small until she reestablished her career. What about her emotional connection to the home where she'd spent 3 formative years? Sentiment was natural, but she needed to be practical. What about the modifications she'd made to accommodate Rose's needs? The ramp, the grab bars, the accessible bathroom? Those could be removed or adapted for a child-friendly environment. Each of Julia's concerns was met with a solution that prioritized Emma's needs over Julia's attachment. The conversation felt less like a family discussion than a hostile negotiation where Julia's position grew weaker with each exchange. "We're not asking you to decide today," Robert said as the meeting wound down, though his tone suggested that prolonged consideration wouldn't be welcome. "The thing is, though," David added, "we've already given notice on our apartment in LA. The lease is up at the end of the month. If this doesn't work out, we'll need to find something else quickly, and the rental market there is brutal." Julia realized that her family had already decided.
The house felt different as Julia climbed the stairs to her room, Rose's former guest room that she'd occupied for 3 years. It no longer felt like home. It felt like a place she was borrowing, a temporary shelter that could be revoked at any moment. The family meeting had transformed her haven into a contested territory, her refuge into a prize that others had already claimed. Standing at the window overlooking Rose's garden, Julia felt the full weight of her family's expectations. She was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to start over, excited about the prospect of rebuilding the career she'd abandoned to care for Rose. She was supposed to accept that Emma's needs trumped her own attachment to the home where she'd spent 3 years learning about love, loss, and the quiet satisfaction of caring for someone who appreciated her presence. But all Julia felt was a growing sense of injustice, a recognition that her family's version of practicality consistently required her to sacrifice while others benefited. The pattern was so familiar it felt like destiny. Julia giving, others taking, everyone pretending it was the natural order of things. The folder of legal documents sat on Rose's dining room table like a judgment waiting to be signed. Julia knew her family expected her compliance, just as they'd expected her to move home when Rose needed care, just as they'd expected her to handle the funeral arrangements while Emma focused on her career obligations. For the first time since Rose's death, Julia felt something other than grief and exhaustion. She felt angry. She escaped to Rose's bedroom that evening, seeking solace among the familiar scents of lavender sachets and old wood polish. The room felt sacred somehow, untouched by the family's calculating discussions downstairs. As she began the painful task of packing Rose's personal belongings, her fingers traced the carved details of the antique dresser that had belonged to Rose's mother. The loose floorboard beneath the dresser caught her attention when it shifted under her weight. Curious, Julia knelt and pried it up, revealing a small wall safe embedded in the floor joists. Her heart pounded as she stared at the combination lock. On impulse, she tried her own birthday, 05-15-92. The tumblers clicked open. Inside lay a manila envelope containing legal documents, old photographs, and a sealed letter addressed to "My dearest Julia" in Rose's distinctive handwriting. With trembling hands, Julia opened the letter first. "My dear girl," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I suspect your family is pressuring you about the house. I've watched them take you for granted these 3 years, dismissing your sacrifices while praising Emma's distant achievements. You gave up your future to care for me, and I will not let that go unrewarded." Julia's tears blurred the words as she continued reading. Rose had secretly transferred the house deed to Julia 2 years earlier, recognizing her devotion and wanting to ensure her security. The legal documents confirmed it. Julia owned the Victorian house outright. "You are not the family disappointment they've made you believe," Rose's letter continued. "You are my chosen heir, the daughter of my heart who showed me what love looks like in action. The house is yours, as it should be. Don't let them bully you into believing otherwise." Julia clutched the papers to her chest, overwhelmed by Rose's posthumous gift of validation. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen and valued. Her grandmother had been watching, understanding, and planning justice while Julia had felt invisible and unappreciated. The next morning, Julia sat in Mr. Thompson's oak-paneled office, the deed and Rose's letter spread across his mahogany desk.
The elderly lawyer adjusted his reading glasses, studying the documents with the thoroughness that had made him Rose's trusted advisor for 2 decades. These are absolutely legitimate, Thompson confirmed, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years in family law. Rose came to me 2 years ago, quite determined about this transfer. She was concerned about your family's tendency to overlook your contributions while favoring Emma's career. Julia felt a wave of relief mixed with vindication. She never told me. She wanted to protect you from family pressure while she was alive. Rose was remarkably astute about family dynamics. Thompson leaned back in his leather chair. She specifically mentioned David's opportunistic nature and your parents' emotional manipulation. She wanted you to have legal protection when the time came. Thompson explained Rose's careful planning, the house transfer, a modest savings account for maintenance, and detailed instructions about preserving the home's historical character. Everything had been designed to secure Julia's future while honoring Rose's legacy. "What about my family's reaction?" Julia asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "They'll be shocked, possibly angry. David may threaten legal action, but he has no grounds. The transfer was made when Rose was mentally competent, with proper legal documentation. Your ownership is absolute." Thompson's confidence steadied Julia's nerves. Rose had anticipated every challenge, every argument her family might raise. The deed wasn't just a legal document, it was Rose's final act of protection for the granddaughter who'd sacrificed everything to care for her. As Julia signed papers officially acknowledging her ownership, she felt something shift inside her. The scared, guilty daughter who'd always deferred to family expectations was transforming into someone with legal rights and moral justification to stand her ground. "Rose believed in you," Thompson said as she prepared to leave. "She saw strength in you that perhaps you haven't seen in yourself." Julia called another family meeting, this time as the rightful owner of the house where they gathered. She sat at the head of Rose's dining table, the deed and letter positioned before her like shields against the inevitable storm. Her family arrived expecting her capitulation, their confident expressions suggesting they'd already begun planning the house's future. "I've made my decision about the house," Julia began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I won't be signing any relinquishment papers." Linda's expression shifted to barely concealed irritation. "Julia, we discussed this. You need to be practical about your situation." "I am being practical." Julia lifted the deed with deliberate calm. "I'm keeping my house." The word "my" hung in the air like a challenge. Emma leaned forward, confusion replacing her earlier confidence. "What do you mean, your house?" Julia read portions of Rose's letter aloud, watching her family's expressions transform from confusion to shock to anger. The revelation that Rose had secretly transferred ownership 2 years earlier exploded their carefully constructed narrative about family needs and practical solutions. "That's impossible," David said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Rose would have mentioned something that significant." "Apparently, she didn't trust you with the information," Julia replied, surprised by her own boldness. Emma's face flushed red. "You manipulated her, a sick, elderly woman who wasn't thinking clearly. This is exactly the kind of influence we were worried about." "Rose was completely mentally competent when she made this decision," Julia sighed firmly. "Mr. Thompson confirmed it. She was protecting me from exactly this kind of family pressure." The room erupted in accusations and denials. David threatened legal challenges, while Linda accused Julia of betraying family trust. Robert sat silent, his face pale, as he processed the implications of Rose's secret planning. But Julia felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the power of being legally and morally right. Rose's letter had armed her with more than ownership papers. It had given her permission to fight back against a family that had taken her for granted too long. The days following Julia's revelation brought swift and brutal retaliation. Emma launched a social media campaign painting Julia as a manipulative caregiver who'd isolated their grandmother and stolen her inheritance. The posts, carefully crafted with Emma's actor's instinct for emotional manipulation, garnered hundreds of sympathetic comments from friends who knew nothing about the family's real dynamics. "My sister convinced my dying grandmother to change her will. 3 years of isolation from family, constant whispers about who really cared, classic elder abuse tactics. We're heartbroken that Grandma's final years were poisoned by greed." Julia's phone buzzed constantly with calls from relatives she hadn't spoken to in years, some offering support, but others echoing Emma's accusations. The small town's gossip network spread the story rapidly, dividing opinion between those who'd witnessed Julia's devotion and those swayed by Emma's polished narrative. David consulted lawyers about challenging the deed transfer, claiming undue influence and mental incapacity, but Thompson's documentation proved unassailable. Rose had been thoroughly evaluated, the transfer properly witnessed, and her reasoning clearly documented. The isolation was devastating. Julia had sacrificed her social connections during the caregiving years, leaving her vulnerable to Emma's character assassination. But unexpected support came from neighbors, like Mrs. Henderson, who'd observed Julia's daily devotion, and from local business owners who'd watched her handle Rose's affairs with quiet dignity. Jessica arrived from San Francisco like a cavalry charge, bringing fierce loyalty and an outsider's perspective on the family's toxic dynamics. "They're gaslighting you," she told Julia bluntly. "Rose saw through their manipulation and protected you. Don't let them rewrite history." The community's split reaction taught Julia a painful lesson about truth versus perception, but it also showed her that some people had been watching, understanding, and respecting her sacrifices even when her family hadn't. With legal ownership secured, Julia began transforming Rose's house from a monument to caregiving into a reflection of her own dreams and identity. She converted Rose's formal study into a home office, preparing to return to social work through freelance family counseling. The space filled with natural light and modern technology felt like a bridge between honoring Rose's memory and building her own future. Marcus Rodriguez returned to help with renovations, their professional relationship deepening into friendship as they worked together to adapt the house for Julia's new life. His respect for both Rose's legacy and Julia's vision created a partnership free from the judgment and manipulation.
"You're bringing the house back to life," Marcus observed as they installed new shelving in Julia's office. Rose would love seeing it become a working space again. Marcus's 10-year-old daughter Sophie brought fresh energy to the house, her curiosity about its history and obvious affection for Julia, creating moments of unexpected joy. Through Sophie's eyes, Julia began to see herself not as the family's designated caregiver, but as someone capable of nurturing without self-sacrifice. Julia's first freelance clients were adult children struggling with aging parents, and she found deep satisfaction in helping them navigate the challenges she'd faced alone. Her experience gave her insights that textbook training couldn't provide, and word spread quickly about her compassionate, practical approach. Emma and David's legal challenge was dismissed when Thompson's documentation proved Rose's mental competency beyond question. The failure of their last-ditch effort seemed to drain their remaining fight, leaving them to focus on finding alternative housing in Los Angeles. The house began filling with new memories, dinner parties with neighbors who'd supported Julia, quiet evenings with Marcus and Sophie, productive days building a practice that honored her education and experience. For the first time in years, Julia felt like she was living rather than simply surviving. 6 months later, Emma returned with her newborn daughter, Lily, staging what appeared to be a reconciliation but felt like another manipulation attempt. She arrived at Julia's door looking exhausted and vulnerable, the baby crying in her arms as she pleaded for temporary shelter. "I made mistakes," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "David's project fell through. We're being evicted, and I have nowhere else to go. I know I hurt you, but this is about Lily now. She's innocent in all this." Julia felt her old caregiver instincts surge, the familiar pull to sacrifice her own boundaries for family need. The baby was beautiful, helpless, and genuinely in need of stability. Emma's distress appeared authentic, stripped of her usual polish and performance. But Marcus and Sophie's presence in Julia's life had taught her the difference between healthy support and enabling dysfunction. She offered practical help, connecting Emma with social services, providing temporary financial assistance, helping research affordable housing options, while maintaining clear boundaries. "You can stay for 2 weeks while you find other arrangements," Julia said firmly, "but this isn't a permanent solution. You need to build your own stability." Emma's reaction revealed the calculation behind her vulnerability. When tears and pleading failed to secure indefinite housing, her demeanor shifted to familiar accusations about selfishness and family abandonment. The baby became a weapon in her arguments, a symbol of needs that should outweigh Julie's boundaries.
Rose would be ashamed of what you've become, Emma said as a final manipulation attempt. Rose gave me this house specifically to protect me from this conversation, Julia replied calmly. She understood the difference between helping and enabling. The 2 weeks tested Julia's resolve daily, but she held firm. She provided the help she could offer without compromising her own security, modeling the healthy boundaries she wished her family had always maintained. 1 year later, Julia's life had transformed beyond recognition. Her home-based practice thrived as she specialized in family dynamics and caregiver support, turning her painful experience into a resource for others facing similar challenges. The Victorian house had become a gathering place for her chosen family, Jessica, Marcus, Sophie, and new friends who appreciated her quiet strength without exploiting it. The Rose Fairfax Foundation, Julia's nonprofit supporting adult children caring for aging parents, operated from the house's former guest room. The organization provided resources, support groups, and advocacy that Julia wished had existed during her own caregiving years. Rose's legacy lived on through action rather than just preservation. Marcus proposed in Rose's garden on a spring morning when the apple trees were blooming, with Sophie's enthusiastic approval and a ring that honored both Julia's practical nature and her newly discovered sense of worth. Their relationship had grown from mutual respect and shared values, free from the power dynamics that had defined Julia's family connections. When Emma's wedding invitation arrived, she'd apparently found stability through David's eventually successful film project. Julia faced one final test of her transformation. The old Julia would have attended out of obligation, hoping for reconciliation that required her to minimize past hurts. The new Julia chose differently. She sent a thoughtful gift with a note expressing genuine wishes for Emma's happiness while maintaining appropriate distance. It was neither vindictive nor self-sacrificing, but simply honest about the relationship's limitations. Julia wrote a letter to Rose that evening, sharing news of her engagement, her foundation's success, and the peace she'd found in claiming her own worth. The house no longer felt like a burden or a prize to be contested, but simply home, a place where love was demonstrated through action and boundaries were respected as expressions of self-care. Standing in Rose's garden as the sun set behind the mountains, Julia understood that her grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the house itself, but the permission to value her own life as much as she'd valued others. The deed had been just paper. The real inheritance was the courage to choose herself. 2 years after claiming her inheritance, Julia stood before a packed community center auditorium, addressing an audience of caregivers who'd traveled from across 3 states to attend the Rose Fairfax Foundation's annual conference. The Victorian house had become a symbol of hope for adult children trapped in the same cycle of self-sacrifice that had nearly consumed Julia's life. "I want to share with you the letter my grandmother left me," Julia began, her voice steady and clear. "Not because my story is unique, but because it's heartbreakingly common. How many of you have given up careers, relationships, your own futures to care for aging parents, only to be told you're just doing what you're supposed to do?" Hands rose throughout the audience, dozens of them, mostly women, their faces reflecting the exhaustion and invisible grief Julia recognized from her own mirror 3 years ago. She saw herself in every tired expression, every guilty posture, every person who'd learned to make themselves small so others could shine. The foundation had grown beyond Julia's wildest expectations. What began as a simple support group meeting in Rose's living room had evolved into a comprehensive resource network, providing legal advocacy, financial planning, respite care, and most importantly, permission for caregivers to value their own lives. The house's phone rang constantly with calls from people desperate for validation that their sacrifices mattered, that their exhaustion was legitimate, that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. "The hardest lesson I learned," Julia continued, "was that loving someone doesn't require erasing yourself. My grandmother understood this. She saw me disappearing and refused to let it continue. Her final gift wasn't just a house, it was the courage to believe I deserved to exist as more than just someone else's caregiver." Marcus sat in the front row with Sophie, now 12 and volunteering as a conference assistant. Their presence grounded Julia, reminding her that the isolated woman who'd once lived only for others had been replaced by someone capable of building healthy, reciprocal relationships. Their wedding was planned for the fall, a celebration of partnership between equals rather than the caregiver dynamic that had defined Julia's past relationships. The conference's breakout sessions buzzed with conversations that would have been revolutionary in Julia's family. Discussions about fair inheritance practices, strategies for involving distant siblings in care decisions, legal protections against manipulation. Attendees shared stories of families who'd rallied around caregivers instead of exploiting them, creating blueprints for healthier dynamics. Dr. Patricia Kim, a geriatrician who'd become the foundation's medical advisor, presented research on caregiver burnout that validated what Julia had experienced firsthand. Society romanticizes self-sacrifice, Dr. Kim explained, but sustainable caregiving requires boundaries, support systems, and recognition that the caregiver's well-being matters too. Julia thought about Emma, who'd sent a brief congratulations email about the foundation's success but remained distant. Their relationship had settled into polite but limited contact. Birthday cards, occasional updates about Lily's milestones, carefully neutral interactions that avoided the deeper wounds neither sister seemed ready to address. It wasn't the reconciliation Julia had once hoped for, but it was honest, which felt more valuable than forced intimacy. David had found modest success with a documentary about family caregiving, ironically profiting from the very dynamics he'd once dismissed as sentimentality. The film featured brief interviews with Julia, though she'd insisted on editorial control to prevent her story from being reshaped into convenient narratives about forgiveness and family healing. During the conference's lunch break, Julia walked through Rose's garden, now expanded to a memorial section, where attendees could plant flowers in honor of lost loved ones. The original apple trees still bloom each spring, but they were joined by roses, lavender, and herbs that create a living testament to growth and renewal. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s, still lived next door and had become an honorary grandmother to the foundation's community. She often tells new attendees about watching Julia's transformation from exhausted caregiver to confident advocate, providing hope that change is possible, even after years of self-neglect. The foundation's impact extended beyond individual families. Julia had testified before state legislative committees about caregiver rights, contributing to policy changes that provided legal protections and financial support for those caring for aging relatives. Rose's house had become a headquarters for systemic change, turning personal pain into broader justice. As the afternoon sessions began, Julia felt Rose's presence in every conversation about dignity, respect, and the radical idea that caregivers deserved care too. The house that had once felt like a burden had become a beacon, drawing people who needed permission to value themselves as much as they valued others.
5 years after discovering Rose's letter, Julia stood in the same bedroom where her transformation had begun, now preparing it for the Foundation's first residential program. The room would house caregivers needing temporary respite while their loved ones received professional care, a service Julia wished had existed during her own darkest moments. The Victorian house had been carefully adapted to serve its new purpose while honoring its history. Rose's formal dining room hosted support group meetings around the same mahogany table where Julia's family had once pressured her to sign away her rights. The irony wasn't lost on her that the space where she'd felt most powerless had become where others found their strength. Sophie, now 15 and wise beyond her years, helped Julia arrange fresh flowers in the memorial room. Their relationship had evolved into something between mentorship and family bond, built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Sophie's presence had taught Julia that nurturing could be joyful when it flowed from choice rather than duty. "Do you ever miss how things were before?" Sophie asked as they worked together. "When your family was all together, I mean." Julia considered the question carefully. "I miss the idea of what I thought we could be," she admitted, "but I don't miss feeling invisible. I don't miss believing that my worth depended on how much of myself I gave away." The Foundation's success had brought unexpected recognition. Julia had been invited to speak at conferences nationwide, her story resonating with audiences who recognized their own struggles in her journey. Publishers had approached about writing a book, and she was considering the project as a way to reach even more isolated caregivers. Emma had remarried after divorcing David, this time to a kind pediatrician who genuinely supported her occasional acting work while providing stability for Lily. Their relationship remained cordial but distant, marked by mutual respect for boundaries neither sister had learned to maintain in their youth. Emma had sent a donation to the Foundation with a note acknowledging the important work you're doing, which felt like the closest thing to an apology Julia was likely to receive. Linda and Robert had gradually re-entered Julia's life,
initially through foundation events where they witnessed the respect and admiration their daughter commanded. The adjustment was awkward. Decades of dismissing Julia's contributions couldn't be easily undone, but they were making genuine efforts to understand the woman she'd become. "I didn't realize how much you'd sacrificed," Linda had admitted during a recent visit. "I thought you were just naturally suited for caregiving. I didn't see how much it cost you." The acknowledgement meant more to Julia than dramatic apologies would have. It represented actual understanding rather than performative guilt, creating space for a different kind of relationship based on who they were now rather than who they'd been. Marcus emerged from the kitchen where he'd been installing accessibility features for the residential program's first guest, a woman whose situation mirrored Julia's own past struggles. Their marriage had deepened Julia's understanding of healthy partnership, two people supporting each other's growth rather than one person disappearing into service. The residential program represented the foundation's evolution from crisis support to systemic change. By providing temporary housing and respite care, they could intervene before caregivers reached the breaking point Julia had experienced. Prevention, she'd learned, was more powerful than recovery. As evening approached, Julia walked through Rose's house one final time before the next day's program launch. Each room held memories of her journey from invisible daughter to confident advocate. The study, where she'd first read Rose's letter, now housed files documenting hundreds of caregivers who'd found their voices. The living room, where she'd once felt like a guest in her own life, now welcomed people seeking permission to matter. The house felt complete in a way it never had during her caregiving years. Then it had been a beautiful prison where she'd slowly disappeared. Now it was a launching pad where others discovered their worth. Rose's legacy lived not in preserved artifacts, but in transformed lives, in families learning healthier dynamics, in a society slowly recognizing that caregivers deserved care too. Julia's phone buzzed with a text from her first residential program participant. "I can't believe this place exists. For the first time in 3 years, I feel seen." The message could have been from Julia's own past, lost and desperate for validation. But now she was the one providing sanctuary, turning her greatest pain into purpose. Rose's Victorian house had indeed become exactly what it was meant to be, not a monument to sacrifice, but a celebration of the radical idea that everyone, including caregivers, deserved to be valued, supported, and loved. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.